Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the seminar on syncretic traditions in the subcontinent over the ages, in collaboration with the Dara Shikoh Center for the Arts, convened by Dr. Jyoti Singh. I think I speak for everyone when I say, when all of you were here, some of you were here yesterday, that each presentation was positively exceptional. And I would say informative, of course, but deeply inspiring considering what we are talking about today. And I think that today is also going to be as fruitful as it was yesterday. We begin with a very important opening address by Mr. Rajiv Mehrotra, speak on the Dalai Lama's syncretic approach to embracing and celebrating diversity. A brief introduction. Rajiv Mehrotra is the honorary founding managing trustee of the Foundation for Universal Responsibility of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, established with the Nobel Peace Prize. He has been a personal student of His Holiness for over 40 years. The foundation is non-sectarian, drawing on the sagacity of His Holiness as the embodiment of the Indo-Tibetan civilizational heritage, its wisdom and methods. It offers perspectives and responses to contemporary challenges, fostering universal human values that celebrate diversity, cultivate inner peace, and promote global harmony. He was educated at St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and the Universities of Oxford and Columbia. He has authored 9 books published in over 50 languages and editions worldwide. His documentary films have garnered over 300 international awards, including 33 national awards from 5 Indian presidents since 1986. Rajiv Mehrotra has served as a judge for the Templeton Prize and was recognized as a global leader for tomorrow by the World Economic Forum in Davos. For several decades, he hosted a range of programs on Doordarshan, which we all remember, including his popular series of in-depth interviews in conversation, the most watched show of its kind at the time. Rajiv Mehrotra.
I'll start standing when I sort of almost don't recognize myself through the many accidents in my life that seem to show up on my curriculum vitae, except to know that I feel the most unworthy student of the Dalai Lama, and even more unworthy of the amazing people who have preceded me in addressing all of you. Thank you for being here this morning. I had almost not come here this morning. I had a bad runny stomach from the Delhi belly, and so if I suddenly freeze, you know what's doing that. When Jyoti had mentioned the idea of syncretism, my immediate response was that beyond the rhetoric and beyond the common discourse of the idea of it, that there were many facets of the Dalai Lama's ideas and philosophy which lead him to embrace this idea in who he is and all that he says and all that he does. So that's what I thought I would talk about, and time and interest permitting, I will sort of go down some alleyways. For the Dalai Lama, syncretism is not about diluting identities, but enriching them. It allows customs to flourish, evolve, and expand. He reminds us that celebrating diversity helps us see our shared humanity. Fostering peace and understanding and engaging with various cultures enables us to appreciate their merits without compromising our uniqueness. So I think that the notion sometimes is in what ways can we assimilate, absorb, and so that we become more alike. And I think that is the dominant discourse that we are politically confronting in India. And he encourages individuals to deepen their faiths and their traditions while respecting others. As he often advises, if you're a Christian, be a good Christian. If you're a Muslim, be a good Muslim. If you're a Hindu, be a good Hindu. The humility and inclusively that he embodies reflect his commitment to discouraging conversions in any form or manner. He reminds us that all religions, even atheism, aspire to alleviate human suffering, in particular their own, and certainly as an ideal, that of the community, making differences secondary to these shared goals. So while that aspiration is shared, the identity, the methodology, he encourages us to hold on to our own. And he frames this vision simply by saying, compassion is my religion. And the philosophy invites humanity to focus on the qualities that unite us, kindness, forgiveness, and service, rather than the labels that divide us. In honoring the teachings of the Dalai Lama and the Syncretic traditions of South Asia, we are called to become bridges, not walls, between cultures and faiths. By embracing diversity as a strength and prioritizing compassion as a universal value, he believes we can build a more harmonious and peaceful world, one defined by unity rather than division. Now I shall venture into somewhat sort of challenging territory for me personally too, and talk about the Buddha and his world view that His Holiness embodies, and why that creates the space and the context for His Holiness to be what he is and who he is. And so we'll just go back to the enlightenment of the Buddha. And so when the Buddha attained enlightenment and got up from from experiencing the true nature of reality, there was a deep silence that he felt, and he didn't know what to do, because he'd left these followers of his or his partners behind, and who he was wondering how they were doing. And this is important, because his experience and understanding of the true nature of reality was non-conceptual. So it was not something that you could communicate. It was not dependent, as in many traditions, and this is not to diminish anyone, but in this particular case, it was not determined by the word or the articulation, a verbal articulation of it, because the very nature of vocabulary is dynamic. And just a little aside, because this was something that had come up post the Buddha, and certainly when Adi Shankara was challenging Buddhism, was the Sanskrit language had evolved from the experiences of thousands of sages and men of spirit who were in the mountains and hiding out in caves, who were really not socialized. And so when the time came when someone felt the need to, in some form or manner, to record this, the Sanskrit language was born. And there was a very close relationship with the word, the sound, the texture, the vibrations of the word, and the form and manner in which the states of mind and being and experience that they were referring to, which is why not widely appreciated, the language froze. So Sanskrit is a frozen language. Today you cannot add a word to Sanskrit. And the tyranny of the Brahmins arose because they were the only ones capable of mediating between the common man and the divine, because through the authentic chanting of the Sanskrit shlokas that communication would take place. So there was a history of the problem with the word and how it had created a hierarchy. So when the Buddha emerged from his enlightenment, he set out to teach method, and wisdom. Now, wisdom was the articulated aspect of articulatable, with all its imperfections that he taught, and that's why the scope of his verbalized teachings at the first turning of the wheel of Dharma as he got out of enlightenment is extremely limited. It was just about the Four Noble Truths, so it talked about the fact of suffering, the causes of suffering, acknowledging that there was a way out of suffering and what that way was. And but then through millennia, it was a more complex form of methodologies that he taught that emerged. And the Buddha always insisted to his disciples that the teaching, the verbalized teaching in particular, must stand up to logic, reason, and lived experience. So it wasn't to be taken at face value because the Buddha had said it. Nor did Buddhism freeze with the words and teachings of the Buddha. Buddhism was inherently evolutionary. And so as different teachers and masters came into the flock, as it were, they developed their own methods and nuances of the wisdom, because since the wisdom was only a poor reflection of the lived experience of enlightenment, whatever it was, you had a tradition that continued to evolve into many different strands and I mean, I was going to say alleyways, but that's not an appropriate way to describe different schools of Buddhism, but different strands. And Buddhism had the genius to be assimilated. So whereas in a sense Hinduism was assimilated, Hinduism assimilated, but Buddhism was assimilated. And it's very interesting that as a part of that tradition of embracing different approaches to whatever that nature of reality is, was that just some months ago, the Asian Buddhist Conference put aside all their differences from Theravada and in the whole range of Buddhist traditions across Southeast Asia, and declared that the Dalai Lama was the preeminent Buddhist monk. So we already see that with the different strand within Buddhism itself, the different strands of Buddhism, retaining their identity and the nuances of their practice, were able to come together, put those differences aside, and say that not because the Dalai Lama was more enlightened than they were, but he was the most efficient and most recognizable spokesperson for their collective wisdom. And if you just, without referencing any other faiths, in traditions where there is so much conflict within the tradition itself, that Buddhism was one of the few faiths that did it without coercion, without collusion, or what have you. So this is sort of the framework within which His Holiness the Dalai Lama approaches syncretism and looks at how different traditions can learn from each other. The other sort of very key element to this approach, and His Holiness talks about it and references it quite often, but I'm going to go aside on a little anecdote, that my first Diksha was from Swami Ranganathananda Maharaj, who was the president of the Ramakrishna Mission later. And what attracted me, amongst the many aspects of the tradition, was that not widely known or discussed or talked about, but done a biography of Ramakrishna, and this was the focus of the book, was that Ramakrishna, Hindu, avatar, steps out of the temple precincts and under the guidance of a Sufi lives the life of a Muslim. He lives the life of a Sikh, a Christian, and acknowledges all of them, and even in the different strands of Hinduism, So he has Totapuri, and then he has Bhairavi teaching him the Tantrayana. I mean, which most people, by association, would be quite scandalized about. What was this, man of God and avatar doing with the tantric traditions? Though I hasten to add that I don't think it was the Tantrayana that we ordinarily associate with the wild and wicked ways of sadhus. But what Ramakrishna concluded at the end of this journey of engagement was that God is one, but these are all different experiences and manifestations of God, and so we will honor them all. Now, the Buddhist approach, as it evolved with His Holiness, was different. But I must finish this anecdote. And one of the great joys of my life was that Swamiji found that I had a natural proclivity to Buddhist ideas. And of course, not widely known, is that when Ramakrishna passed away, Vivekanand, in his house in, I forget the name of the street, in Calcutta, had a separate room dedicated to the Buddha. And he went and meditated on the Buddha. And the Ramakrishna mission follows the Buddhist model of the Sangha. It is democratic. It is all-inclusive. They celebrate different traditions, decentralized, and no significant scandals in 150 years. And so he kept nudging me into the study, a more serious study of Buddhism. And then I met His Holiness. And the great joy of my life was that Swamiji and the Dalai Lama became good friends. And he's done a book called The Kinship of Faith, His Holiness, and there are a number of pages in that book on this meeting with the Dalai Lama. So in a sense that I had two teachers who came from different traditions. And so this whole idea that we are talking about here is deeply embedded in my own consciousness, both because of the narrative of the Dalai Lama and of Swamiji. And the fact that I would then had my root teacher has been the Dalai Lama for 40 years, but he was my original teacher. And I think that in my own life, because of these two marvelous men and these two traditions, this has been manifest and embodied. But as I began to explore with His Holiness, and he had a lot more time in the 80s and 90s than he does now, and I began to understand, and his own vocabulary evolved, and he was influenced by Swamiji's narratives about Ramakrishna's own engaging with and celebrating diversity. But he arrived at a somewhat different conclusion, also influenced in some measure by Vivekananda. So when Vivekananda said, he described these four archetypes, about the Karma Yoga, Raja Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Jnana Yoga. And so what he was doing was, he was saying that each individual has a different mental disposition, and hence will follow these are not linear, isolated, packaged systems of practice. And so they will overlap in some ways. And so from this, I think this was one of the springboards for His Holiness, that he would frequently say that each one of us needs a different mental diet. So just as we need a different physical diet, we need a different mental diet. And for someone, the mental diet that Islam provides is what is suitable and valuable for him. And what another faith provides is suitable and valuable for that person. And hence this idea of celebrating diversity rather than looking for tolerating or uniting or unity and diversity was born. And in a very emphatic that this should not be the case. And we should honor the different mental diets that people have. Then, and I will talk about that shortly, and that included the embracing of all contemporary knowledge, and that meant modern science. But before I come to that, the ideas of Buddhism that he focused on were inherently secular. and acceptable across the traditions, except perhaps people who were uncomfortable with the idea of reincarnation. But that's a topic for another day. And so one of the very key dimensions of nurturing compassion. So when I talk about the method, so what kind of methods did Buddhism have to offer? And why was the method important? The method was important because Buddhism, and the Dalai Lama talks about the Indo-Tibetan civilizational heritage. And what is that Indo-Tibetan civilizational heritage? It offers the most sophisticated mind training techniques in human history. And why do we talk about training the mind? And His Holiness will often argue that, look, we spend so much time in training ourselves for our professions, to train ourselves to play the games we play efficiently, to build up our bodies, to see that our toenails are manicured and have the right color on them, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's diverse the amount of time we invest. But somehow we have not embraced and do not include in our everyday lives training the mind. And it is the mind that processes all our experiences. Now, what do you train the mind to achieve? And drawing on Buddhist ideas, he said we should train the mind to be compassionate. There are other aspects of shunya and what have you, which I don't want to go into, but as an accessible matrix for the community that all traditions would find acceptable would be compassion. And so what is the methodology that you use to nurture the mind, and why nurture the mind? Not only because it processes human experience, but it is only when our minds are trained that our responses move beyond the intellect to being deeply reflexive. So you can listen to people talking doomsday about don't be angry, don't be envious, you shouldn't have too much materialism, follow the spirit. But what do you do to train the mind so that becomes a everyday reflex response? And of course, talking about it is the way of the Jnana Yogi, but that's difficult and challenging, and that's a journey of its own. So when you meditate, and what is meditation in our vocabulary? Meditation is merely familiarizing the mind. And so just like if I want to build up this muscle, I will have to keep repeating it and repeating it and repeating it till the muscle develops. And then I can do a little less of it to sustain it. So similarly, we have to build up the muscles and the biochemistry of the brain by repeated practice and by repetition. And so what we do in meditation is that we bring up certain ideas and thoughts. And the first stage of that is, we call it analytical meditation. You analyze. So in order to nurture compassion, for example, there are these sort of many practices, but I will just say 2 or 3 accessible ones. And so one is, of course, interdependence. So we begin to recognize that we live in an interdependent world. And, that I'm speaking here, someone has put a microphone. I know Jyoti's father for about more than 50 years, and he's been a mentor to me. That probably makes a little biased. And, a whole range of, a chain of things happen. And if you begin to think of the coffee that you drink this morning, where the coffee was grown, the fertilizer that came, and, where the fertilizer came. I mean, it's an infinite aspect of it. So the minute you start doing that, you first do it with more impersonal elements, and then you start doing it with our dependence on human interaction and the human beings that do that. So that nurtures a natural sense of connection with other human beings and diminishes the antidote, or the antonym for syncretism, which is division and divide and what have you, the minute we begin to see that. So that is one practice. So you reflect on it, and when that emotion rises for you, you hold it and you familiarize the mind with the emotion. The second one is that if you believe in reincarnation, and then that suggests that each one of you here at some point in your previous avatars will have been my mother or my sister or what have you. Now, the minute I begin to recognize that, just because my mother is not here in her own, in the form that she was my mother, doesn't mean that I no longer experience love and affection, for her, and so on and so forth. And a very powerful practice, which I still struggle with, but it's a part of my repertoire to try and crack it, and that's called exchanging oneself with others. So, traditional, conventional practices of healing, New Age healing in particular, would be that you visualize golden light comes through your head and removes all your pain and suffering, and you progressively are freed of it. But in exchanging oneself with others, it's different. What happens is that I try to visualize somebody who's suffering. So I take in their suffering as black smoke, and that it enters me, it goes into my sense of self. And of course, the sense of self is, physically, I might feel it's located in my chest. And then it comes into the chest, it pierces the sense of self, and it goes back as golden light to heal that person. So it is the willingness through repeated practice, through image and symbolism, that we try and train ourselves to take on the suffering of others so that they may be healed. Now, these are very, very powerful practices if, to the degree that you're able to do them and sustain them. So it is this that forms the basis of His Holiness's huge openness to people who follow different diets, mental diets, and to other people's suffering. Because this is the very basis of his philosophy and of his philosophical practice. And the other thing that comes up there is that when we talk about the Buddha who experienced or got glimpses, he actually experienced it in all its vitality and energy, the true nature of reality. And what is that true nature of reality? And how does he try and explain it? This is a bit of a tangent, but I think it's seminal to the Mahayana school of Buddhism, so I will try and explain it. I don't myself experientially haven't got it, but intellectually I have some sense of it. So I just want to put that on the table. And that really is that people say that in Buddhism you have the idea of shunya, and the shunya is nothingness or emptiness. That's not what it is. All it is saying is that ultimately when something exists, it exists on the basis of causes and conditions. So just to give you an example, ice cream. Ice cream exists because the cause is that you've put together either blotting paper or whatever you decided to use and create ice cream, and then it's at a certain temperature. Now when the condition of it being at that temperature changes, then it's no longer ice cream, it's something else. And even if you try and reconstitute it, if you ever tried to have melted ice cream put in a freezer, you'll find it's not the same ice cream. So that everything that exists, including us human beings, exists because of certain causes. Now, why does all this reflect on our respect for other traditions? For other traditions, because each tradition came into being in the context of certain causes and conditions. And so all I'm trying to point to is that this approach is deeply, deeply embedded in its very basis of its practice and its philosophies. And then when the idea of the ultimate reality comes in, that he has embraced science in a big way. And I had the privilege of moderating a dialogue between the Archbishop of now not, but at that time he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, and the Dalai Lama. And Rowan Williams said to His Holiness that, all faith leaders have to thank you for two significant things. One is that you have created the precedent for an engagement with science, because science has appeared or seemed to be at odds. So even today they're struggling with Darwin, whether Darwin should be taught in American schools or not. The right is resisting that. So His Holiness took the view that we must embrace all knowledge, and in particular, contemporary knowledge. So when we talk about these different realities, today we know that the very nature of reality is determined by the presence of the observer. If you have any science, and if not, you can just go and look at it. It's called what's it called? That experiment where you put rays of light. Anyway, name of the experiment is gone, but it's a very common, popular experiment in modern science and in quantum theory in particular, where you have two. It's called a slit experiment. So where you put in the light, and it goes, and you start seeing waves. That's right. But if you it changes depending on the observer. So the observer determines the nature of reality. So there is no absolute reality that we can hang on to and say my reality is superior to yours, or whatever it is. So I just wanted to share this grounding in these elements that have enabled the Dalai Lama to take the positions that he has. And so his interaction with science has encouraged very innovative partnerships between Buddhist academics and scientists, especially in neuroscience, psychology and physics, and he has been has played a seminal role in setting up a Mind and Life Institute and the Emory Tibet Science Initiative. He has emphasized Buddhism's fit with empirical inquiry and has included science as a subject in monastic education. He has modernized Tibetan Buddhist organizations, and most profoundly has been the impact on the research of consciousness, ethics, and the nature of reality. And I will come to ethics in a bit. And resulting from this, he has built amazing bridges of ongoing discourse between between scientific research and Buddhism. And it has had very significant ramifications for science, largely because he has, just as in the split experiment, that he has emphasized and science has begun to embrace the idea of subjective experience, that the purely empirical is not final, and that the subjective is as important as purely objective science. And of course, this models for the Dalai Lama how faiths and traditions might constructively interact with contemporary knowledge to serve humanity. And equally exciting has been the collaboration between Buddhist psychology and modern psychology. And this has fundamentally changed our knowledge of emotions and mental health. He has motivated research demonstrating how meditation changes the brain, and there is now a mindful-based stress reduction technique that was introduced by John Kabat-Zinn at Massachusetts General Hospital 20 years ago. And so now they're going into very, very deep research as to how and what forms of meditation and what kind of impact they create physiologically. And a very, very important discovery of this has been neuroplasticity, because it was normally assumed that if you were born with a certain kind of brain, the brain was fixed. And so while you may change your, inverted commas, habits, this reflexive response that I was talking about, which means that now it is measurable, physiologically measurable, that the brain can change its physiology. And hence the idea of neuroplasticity has been is very important, and also demonstrates that the mind can be trained. So just like I can build up this muscle, I can build up the elements and the biochemistry of my brain. And so this improves emotional control and resilience. And some of it is just vocabulary, in the sense that I think the number is and I have a research scholar colleague of mine sitting here. I think Buddhism has something more than 1,000 different categories of emotions, with many subheads and what have you. and whereas Western vocabulary will be less than 20 if you're lucky. And so when healing takes place, it is approached through these many different nuances. And then they have found that and just to sort of connect why compassion, in terms of not just because it's universally shared, but also in terms of modern psychology. Because now testing in laboratories, and Daniel Goleman is a famous chap who's written a thing on emotional intelligence and what have you, and their research has demonstrated that people who have mental health problems are obsessed with I, me, mine. So even when they do testing and you come and have a conversation and you just tick off how many times they've used the word I, me, mine, that's a sure sign that the person has some kind of problem. Now, the minute you're able to cultivate compassion, you start thinking about others and us. And so what that does also is that the sense of the self that suffers softens. I mean, we're not yet at the position, when you're truly enlightened and the self goes off. I mean, there's no self. That, of course, is debatable with Hindu ideas, but we'll leave it at that. And so that becomes the core. So it is these elements that enable His Holiness to embrace, not just syncretically, sit on a stage and say, oh, all religions preach the same thing. He is actually able to go to the places of worship and pilgrimage of other traditions and engage in their practices. And you'll see some wonderful photographs there of His Holiness doing just that. And I remember that he went to in Ajmer, the Khwaja Sahib's tomb, Ajmer Sharif. And, he went there and he was given around, and then where Khwaja Sahib is buried, he lay down and prostrated flat in front of and it must have been, I don't know, to us it seemed eternity, but even if it was 15 minutes, 20 minutes, he just prostrated and he got up. And he had a very peaceful expression in his face, and he didn't want to be disturbed. And so later on I said, what happened? And he said, I experienced the divine. So I said, but Your Holiness, you're agnostic. What do you mean you experienced the divine? He said, I experienced what it must feel like to experience the divine. So there are numerous such examples in which he has engaged in the experiential learning from different traditions and stood up for faith. So when 9/11 happened, he was the first leader from around the world, and for many months he was the only religious leader to stand up for the Muslims. And I have attended right here at the Indian International Center, where the Sunnis and Shias from Ladakh have come to seek his intervention to address or resolve some of their issues. And so it is this very, very deeply experiential dimension of his approach to syncretism that I wanted to point to. The examples of these are infinite. Even our foundation, for many years, we were running till there was a change in government. We were running out of Bangalore, an interfaith for young people, an interfaith pilgrimage. So again, young people would go and spend 3 or 4 days in the places of worship of different traditions. So they would actually go and live in a madrasa, engage in their practices and what they were doing. So it was that fundamental in his striving. And then, I think we're running out of time, so I'll just sort of wind up and open it up for questions. No? No, you're obviously very kind, but sort of 2 other areas that of intervention that he has sought to, by using these meditative approaches, has been the cultivation of what he started calling secular values. And then we realized that in India, secular was already a dirty word. And so it just became universal values. And to try and build into curricula some of these these practices and more, to try and, just like they spend time on PT, young people, that could we create a context for them to also exercise their minds, and in terms of emotional intelligence is what they talk about. And the Delhi school's happiness curriculum is substantially based on that. And so I think I'll take some questions. I mean, I could. I mean, I have. I had planned, but because His Holiness is often talked about the Nalanda tradition, and how he is the heir to the Nalanda tradition. And yes, I would be remiss if I didn't speak for 2 minutes on the Nalanda tradition, because it is so seminal to His Holiness, and the Nalanda tradition to His Holiness was really the model. Because in Nalanda, people came in from all across the world. And even though it was a Buddhist university, they engaged in dialectic and debate with other traditions. And so if a Nagarjuna or a Buddhist philosopher came up with an idea, he had to present it to a secular audience. So its reasoning and logic would stand up to reason, not just of the converts, because you were already Buddhist and so inclined. So that it provided a huge framework for training the mind and for accepting contrarian views. And so the emphasis there was on synthesis and not on superiority. And so debates were not meant to be won in Nalanda. They were meant to illuminate diverse perspectives. And that was amongst the many exciting things about, but another talk another day on the Nalanda tradition. So so thank you very much.
Any questions? We have to keep them short, but anyone?
I can't promise the answer will be short.
No. Okay. You spoke about the frozen tradition of the frozen language of Sanskrit. I don't know what, I would like to know your opinion. There's a great attempt now to contemporize the spoken Sanskrit. And Dr. Anuradha Chaudhary has been very, she's taken it up as a mission. She's a great Sanskrit Pandit. We worked with her. And she is trying to bring, saying that we can use Sanskrit for as an everyday language. So I'd just like to know what you think about it. There is a village in Karnataka, Melkote, where you must be knowing about it, where they speak Sanskrit. They all speak Sanskrit to each other. So is it really a frozen language, is my question.
The language was designed to be frozen. Now, whether it is still frozen or should be, I really have to be honest, I have not reflected on it. So I can't give you an intelligent, considered answer. But I think that the intent of the Sanskrit language was to freeze it so that the authenticity of the experience that it documented. And I will add a few sentences because I promised a longer response. Interestingly, when Buddhism traveled to Tibet, most religions, virtually all religions, it was the word that traveled. Through travelers, people took scriptures and Bible and XYZ. Not so in Tibet. Because in Tibet, it was the practitioner who went from India to Tibet and took with him, I don't know if there were any hers at that time, took with him the scripture and the method and taught both for this juxtaposition. Sorry? No. It was in Pali or, language evolved. But the greatest evolution of language related to spirit happened in Tibet. So what the Tibetans did was they expanded their language and their vocabulary to reflect in the ways that Sanskrit was trying to do, the subtle experience, so that you had a new vocabulary that was added to the existing vocabulary. So what is happening now, there's a Central Institute for Tibetan Studies in Sarnath. So many of these manuscripts were smuggled out, some came out with His Holiness themselves. So they're trying to decode them, to reconstruct what that teaching was. And which is why His Holiness, often says that, India is the guru and we are the chelas. Of course, this chela says, you are the guru and we are the chelas. Thank you very much.
Empathy and compassion, or do you think it's just terminology?
It's the problem with vocabulary is
Yes.
that in different cultures it has different associations. So what is love, for example? A lot of religions talk about cultivate love. Now happiness, that's the most dangerous word of all. So now, is it happiness that the American Constitution has decreed it should be for its people? Or is it what a Buddhist monk would seek to aspire? So it is very nuanced, and it really depends on how you use it, how your environment uses the language. I mean, I would be quibbling about, I prefer empathy, but or you can ask Shashi Tharoor. Thank you.